What's up, YouTube? This video is meant to introduce new players who have never played Axis and Allies before or have been out of it for a while to what many believe to be the greatest version of Axis and Allies and one of the greatest war-fighting board games to be created, and that would be Axis and Allies 1940 Global Edition. Now, there's a number of versions of Axis and Allies on the market now that have come out since the OG 1980s version of the game that I grew up on, in all sorts of scenario board games. This one focuses specifically on Global 1940, but a lot of the principles are going to be the same or at least similar to other versions of the game, each of which tweaks the rules just a little bit. First thing to note is that you will not find Axis and Allies 1940 Global on the store shelves or on a website as such, because it's not sold as Global 1940. It's actually the combination of two games. That would be 1940 Europe and 1940 Pacific. Pretty straightforward. You might notice a little bit of lineup between these two games, because all you need to do is buy both games and then slide them together. And now you've got the Global 1940 map. Now you might think this is some sort of home-ruled nonsense, but it's actually designed to work this way. If the synchronization between the two boards didn't give it away, the rules for the global edition of the game are right here in the out-of-the-box rule book for both Europe and Pacific. You can open them up to the back where you see global rules, and that will explain to you how the game works a little differently with the two boards put together. So before we dive into the mechanics of the game, start big picture, and we'll talk about what the game is about and what the objectives are. Hopefully, it doesn't need to be said that a World War II game is about the Axis powers versus the Allied powers, the actual war that took place back in the 30s and 40s. So the Axis and powers include Japan, and on the European side, Germany, and Italy is actually a separate playable Axis country in this version of the game. Some others it's not. Allied powers would, of course, be the United States, the United Kingdom, and the USSR. Those are the main Allied powers in this version of the game. That's subdivided even a little further. There is France, which at the beginning of the game has not yet been conquered. There is what's called here UK Pacific, or the Indian and Southeast Asian UK colonies that existed at the time. We'll talk about how those two countries work together. Suffices to say, for now, it's a separate playable country in this game. And we have what's called the Anzac, or Australia, New Zealand. They are another allied country that's playable in the game. So obviously conquering the opposite side is the ultimate goal. There are different ways for measuring victory. Even in the out-of-box rules, there are a couple choices. They usually revolve around these victory cities here. So you will see particular cities called out on the map in red on each side, and there are a certain number on the Pacific map, certain number on the European map here. These are significant cities, high population, high strategic value, and in one version of the game, victory is measured by how many of these victory cities each power conquers. So for example, if you take so many on the Pacific map or so many on the European map, that means that side has gained a sufficient amount of power that they've defeated the other side. Our house rules, a lot of other versions of the game, track victory tokens, other ways of measuring victory. Suffice to say for these purposes now that The object of the game is to dominate the other side and not necessarily eradicate them from the board, but to defeat enough of their military, to gain enough power, enough territory, enough economic strength that you are indisputably in control of enough of the board that you have won the war. So that is the object of the game going forward. Now let's get into the mechanics. This is a turn-based game, so each country takes its turn and then it moves on to the next country in a predetermined order. Each turn consists of the following 6 sequences, 6 phases right out of the rule book here. That's purchase and repair units, combat move, conduct combat, non-combat move, mobilizing new units, and collecting income. In practice, this really collapses down to 3 or 4 real main phases that will become second nature real quick. So in essence, you're starting the turn by purchasing units to replace the ones that are about to die. So there's a little bit of pre-planning involved in buying units before they can actually get on the board. You can't put them on the board right away. So you're guessing what you're going to need going forward and purchasing that. You move the units that are going to engage in combat, then you actually roll the dice and make them fight. There are some movements that you can take place after combat, and then you put the new units that you bought at the beginning of the turn on the board, get your money, and you move on. All right, with that in mind, let's start with the beginning, which is buying new units. And before we talk about buying these new units, we got to understand a little bit about what these units are. What do we have to choose from when we're spending our money as a country? Well, we've got displayed here all the different pieces that you're going to have the chance to choose from. On the top row here, we have our land units. These are obviously the units that you build on land territories. So here, your basic piece in any war-fighting board game is going to be the infantry guys, or however you want, men, however you want to refer to them. These are going to be your primary grunt unit here for getting the job done. Then you get a few more specialized pieces with different abilities. We have the artillery, which adds a little extra offensive oomph. Then we have the mechanized infantry, which essentially operate as infantry themselves, but obviously on wheels, so they get a little bit more mobility. Next, we have tanks, which obviously add not only mobility, but also defensive and offensive capabilities the other units don't have. Finally, an anti-aircraft gun, which pretty self-explanatory, shoots down planes and doesn't do much else. And we have air units. There are 3 to choose from this version of the game: fighters, tactical bombers, and strategic bombers. Each of those are going to have different movement abilities, different offensive and defensive capabilities. Fighters obviously a little bit more versatile and can fight against other land units as well as air units. Tactical bombers can fight against air units, but are primarily designed to deliver ordnance to land. And then strategic bombers, big offensive capability, big extra range for movement as well, not so much on the defensive capability. And then finally, we have sea-based units. Here we have a number to choose from, each with its own little variations. The battleship is going to be the biggest and baddest of them all, the toughest and the hardest to kill, also the one that does the most damage. Next is the aircraft carrier, and that's also pretty straightforward. Allows you to project power with your planes, actually designed so that the plane units fit right on top. Aircraft carrier can also carry a tactical bomber, and it can carry 2, any combination of those 2 units. So you'll have the ability to actually physically carry those air units on the board as you go. Next in line, we have a cruiser, step down in both size and power. Then a destroyer, which its special ability is the ability to hunt down submarines, and then we have, of course, the submarines themselves, big powerhouse in World War II naval combat, and followed lastly by the transport, which, as the name suggests, has the ability to carry land units across the sea from one port to another. Those are all the combat units, the military units that you'll be able to build in the game. In addition, you can also spend your money on facilities. Facilities are, as the name suggests, buildings and capabilities that you're upgrading the capital capacity of your land territories. They're not mobile units themselves. And we have, in this game, we have air bases, which add to the range and some defensive capabilities of your air units, naval bases that do the same thing for ships. And then we have factories. Here we have what's represented to be minor and major factories, which have different costs as well as production capabilities, but it's these factory units that indicate where you can build the new units. Now, the money that you use in the game is called IPCs, industrial production credits. May as well just call them money or dollars or whatever the shorthand is that works for you. In the out-of-box game, they give you paper bills to work with. You're going to see here already some of these pieces that I'm showing you are kind of collector upgrades and enthusiast aftermarket type of material that we're using here. Trying to stick to the basics as much as possible, but it's inevitable here. So, for example, I use the poker chips. A lot of folks do instead of the paper money. It's just more fun and sturdy to play with, but nevertheless, that represents the money that you get to spend in the game. To summarize how much each of these costs when you're looking to spend your money and what it is you're really investing in, go no further than the mobilization zone box, which is handily printed here on the bottom of each board. You'll find this in the rule books as well, but here you got the summary of what they cost. That's in terms of IPCs, number of IPCs you have to spend to buy each one of those units. And then you have an attack, defense, and move rating for each unit. Pretty straightforward. These are all in terms of a 6-sided die. So when you see an attack of 1 for an infantry there, that means on a 6-sided die, if you're attacking with an infantry, you've got to roll a 1 in order to hit with that unit. Now, its defense is 2. That means you can hit on either a 1 or a 2 when it's acting on the defense rather than on the offense. And of course, it only moves 1 space. Same for artillery, except that its attack value is a 2 and defense is 2. So you've got a little bit of a bump up in attack value, but then it costs 1 more IPC. Mechanized infantry, same thing. It attacks at a 1, defends at a 2, just like a regular infantry, but it can move 2 spaces at a time instead of 1. I'll go ahead and take a look at these. You'll get a chance to know these values a little bit better as you play the game. But that's what makes each piece different, and that's what you're doing in the beginning of your turn, buying these new units with these capacities in mind. So now let's move forward to step 2 in the game, which is combat. And we're going to lump combat movement and combat itself together when we're talking about this. But combat movement does come first, and that's when you're moving all your units into the theater of war that they're going to participate in on that turn. Now, we've set up here as an example, we've got the UK there in the primary UK territory where London's located, and we've got some German forces located in the Holland territory. Now, those are both land spaces, and between them you see that there is a water space. Little word about the board. It's broken down into boxes, into different territories, both land and sea territories, and each one of the sea territories is numbered to help tell it apart, and you see the lines specifically where each one is bound. And we have land territories, each of which have a name. That makes it easier to figure out where everybody's at. So when we're talking about movement, we're talking about moving one piece to another territory on the board. So in this example, UK is going to launch an attack on the German forces here in Holland. Now, none of its land units are in that space, so in fact, none of its units at all, so we're going to get them into position. In here, in the Holland territory, we've got 2 German infantry, a German tank, and a German plane. So when the UK conducts its combat move, that means it's going to get its pieces into position to attack Holland. Now, with its land units, they can't just walk over the sea space here in 110. They need to get there one way or another. This example, we're going to use the transport. So you'll recall this piece right here is a transport. Transports have a carrying capacity of 1 infantry and 1 other land unit. That means an infantry and another infantry, infantry and a mech infantry, infantry and a tank, or an infantry and an artillery. So in this case, that combat movement is going to include this infantry and this mech infantry here hopping on the transport, and they're going to be dropped into Holland because the transport not only has that carrying capacity, all sea units actually in the game have a movement of 2. So once they get on that transport, this transport could have gone 1, 2, and dropped them off here in Norway. It could have gone 1, dropped them off in Denmark. If it had the ability to go through the strait here, which we'll talk about that later, it could have technically gone even into Sea Zone 113 and dropped them off into an adjacent land territory to that sea unit. But for these purposes, we'll keep those folks here in 110. Now, you'll notice we've got a battleship and a cruiser here as well. These sea units have a bombardment capability, which we can talk about a little bit later. But that means that they can shoot their cannons into an adjacent land zone. So they're going to stay where they are in 110 because they're actually in position to do that right now. They're already adjacent to that land territory. But there's a lot of defense here, and frankly, rolling 2 1s is not going to win the battle, even with the support of a battleship and a cruiser. So we need to get some air units in there as well. So each of these air units can participate in the attack. In this example, we have a fighter and a strategic bomber. Fighters have a movement of 4 spaces. Strategic bombers can move up to 6 spaces a turn. But they can't land in territories that are freshly conquered. So even if we win this battle here, those planes can't end their total movement in Holland. They have to have a safe place to land, and you have to know that there's a safe place for them to land before conducting combat movement. You can't do kamikaze runs, meaning you can't use up all your movement points to get them into a battle knowing that they have no safe place to land, no legal landing space at the beginning of the turn. So what we're going to do here, both of these can participate because this plane can go 1, 2 into the battle, and that's where its combat movement stops. Because we don't know if it's going to live through that battle. We don't know what's happening here. But we know that it has a legal landing space because it can go 3 and then 4 back to the UK. So that can participate in the battle because it can land. It doesn't have to. It could be killed. It could be destroyed. It could end up landing somewhere else. But as long as we know there's somewhere it could land, then it's legal for it to make that combat move. The Strat Bomber can go 6. So it has no problem going 1, 2 right here into Holland to participate in that battle. You're going to conduct all your combat movement at once, meaning that all of the battles that the UK intends to engage in across the globe need to happen all at the same time. We don't have those set up right now. This is just the one example that we're working with, but all of that would happen. And there are markers, there are different ways to keep track of those movement points to the air units that can get confusing and easy to forget in the middle of a round. So there are ways to track that, but we're just remembering it right now since it's the only example we're working with. But once all that combat movement is done, now we're going to move on to actually conducting the combat. And we can do that. We can roll those dice right here on the board if we wanted to, since this is the only example we've got set up. But to show you how it's done, typically we're going to pull out what's called the battle board. And here's one example of a battle board. This particular design is one of those aftermarket hobbyist things that I referred to before, where the different colors come from. That's a different video. We can explain that. But for right now, it illustrates how a battle board works. And all it does is we take all of those units that are engaged in the battle on the board, and we transport them over here to this little sideboard, which I've put on top of the map for just purposes of illustration here. Wouldn't do that in a normal game. What it does is it helps you remember the combat values for each one of these units, so you can track them during the course of the battle. So as I mentioned, the infantry and the mech infantry here on the attacker side of the board, they both roll a 1, which means they can only hit if you roll a 1 on the 6-sided die. We didn't bring any units to roll on a 2. The fighter attacks at a 3. That's its combat value when it's on the attack side. The strat bomber is 4. And we've put these 2 ships in here just to remember that they get their 1 bombardment shot. That's a one and done kind of thing, just a support shot. And in fact, you'll notice that we've even put this cruiser here on the wrong spot. It says cruiser right here because the cruiser, its bombardment shot hits on a 3, whereas the battleship is on a 4. And the same 1 through 4 system works for defenders as well. So on the defender side of the board, we have the 2 infantry, both of which defend on a 2 as opposed to attacking on a 1. The tank defends on a 3, and it attacks on a 3 as well. Very versatile and tough unit. And then the fighter. The fighter defends on a 4, even though it attacks on a 3. So that's going to be a lot tougher. Now, the attacker rolls first, and we'll go through that example, and it rolls each of its dice and delivers a certain number of hits to the defender. And then the defender is going to take those hits right away. And when those hits happen, they move back here behind the casualty zone. Why don't they just come off the board? Well, because they get the chance to fire back. This is a kind of turn-based illustration of what is supposed to be a simultaneous combat. So even though the attacker goes first, the defender gets to shoot back, even though we know that the piece is going to die at the end of that round. So let's go ahead and simulate with a couple dice here how this would work. Let's roll the 2 1s. And we have, look at that, 1 hit. One of those infantry scored a great shot. So the defender is going to take that hit on an infantry and move him back behind the casualty zone. Now we're going to roll for the 2 3s here on the attacker side. And again, 1 hit. When you attack on a 3, that means 1 through 3 hit. That 6 is a miss. The 2 is a hit, so the defender is going to take that second hit on its other infantry. And now we have 2 4s. Let's roll those 4s. Again, 1 hit. You would have expected more, but that's the way the cookie crumbles. So 1 more hit, defender will take that on the tank. We're going to go ahead and take these ships off the board because they've gotten their 1 pot shot in. They don't have any more participation in this land battle. But now it's the defender's turn. The defender is going to shoot back. Let's roll first for the 2 2s representing the infantry, and that is a terrible, terrible roll. They both miss. Now we're going to roll 1s for the tank, which misses. This is representative of how my battles usually go when I'm on the defending side. And a number 4, missed the board, but that's a hit. We'll count it. That's a 3. Now the attacker takes 1 hit now total. And because it already shot, there's no casualty zone for the attacker. They just go ahead and take them off the board. So we're going to take that infantry off. And now that round of combat is over. Take those pieces off. And if we're the UK, we're looking at this, we've got 3 pieces left. Germans only have 1. So we're feeling pretty good about ourselves. We're going to go ahead and roll again. Now, if the attacker didn't feel like pressing the attack, it could call off the attack and retreat. And we can talk about that during the non-combat movement phase. That's an option available to it. But the attacker always has the ability to keep rolling until the battle is done, either by one side being completely destroyed or the attacker calling up the attack. But we're going to roll again. Here's a 1, and that's a miss. Roll for the 3, that's a miss. And we roll for the 4, that's a hit. Always count on those bombers. So we got the hit that we needed. Defender still gets to roll back at a 4, and it misses. Okay, so that battle is over. This piece is off, and the UK is going to occupy Holland. Now, quick little note here. Interesting tactical decision that one would have had to have made if that fighter, that last German fighter, had actually gotten a hit. Now, normal course of action might be to kill the least expensive piece here, which would have been that mechanized infantry. But what would that have left us with? Just a fighter and a bomber. And what did we say at the beginning of this combat exercise? Aircraft can't occupy territory, newly conquered territory, by themselves. So the UK player would have been in the tough choice of either killing the mech infantry and essentially losing the battle, having killed all those units, but not occupying Holland and flying its planes back in essentially a stalemate, or killing one of these planes so that the mech infantry could live. In that case, the mech infantry would have been put back on the board. Of course, that's what we're going to do now because it did live through that battle. And now it has conquered that territory, and we're going to slap a little UK marker on there now to indicate that that is now UK territory. You see the board as it begins is tinted to show the controller at the beginning of the game. So all these kind of dark greenish territories here, those are the starting German territories, and you see they've already got little German markers on there to indicate that. Just like the French are blue, the Italians have their little green circle bits going on, and the UK's are a little more yellowish and so forth. So that's the default. To indicate change of control, each country has these control markers, and that's how we do it at the end of the combat round. All right, so non-combat movement, we've talked about that. That's usually most important for aircraft. They're both going to land back in the UK here, and that's what we consider non-combat movement. Now, there are other forms of non-combat movement. For example, pieces that did not participate in a combat may now use their movement points to go somewhere else that doesn't involve combat. In other words, traveling on friendly territory. They're not going to do anything that involves attacking another player because, they missed their opportunity to do that during the combat phase. But a lot of this game is similar to chess, in which you are positioning your pieces for future combat. Just like at the beginning of the turn, we had to think ahead one turn in what we bought because we're planning for needs that we're going to have at the end of that turn. Well, on these non-combat phases, we're planning ahead for the next turn as well. So, for example, this artillery and this tank, they didn't participate in the battle. So maybe they want to move somewhere else that's friendly. They could move up here to Scotland, for example. That's both within their movement capabilities. On the continent, they might have more movement options, but that's what they've got for now. This mech infantry, anything that participated in the combat is done, even if they would have had more movement points. So a mech infantry can move 2, for example. It only moved 1 to get into Holland, but it participated in combat, so now it's done. It can't move anymore. Same goes for these ships. Now, if this transport had not participated in the battle, it might be able to pick up this tank and, move 2 and take it somewhere else, like up to Iceland here, for example, if you really wanted to do that. But the transport did participate in battle, so it can't move. Same goes for the battleship and the cruiser. They didn't move any spaces, but they participated in the battle by launching those amphibious pot shots into the battle, the bombardment movement, so they don't get to move anymore. But that's what happens after combat, is the non-combat movement. That's landing your planes, moving units that did not participate in battle, and that's that. And last thing after that is putting the units on the board that you bought at the beginning of the turn. Now, we didn't simulate that, but whatever money you would have had, you would have put them aside, sometimes in that mobilization zone, sometimes somewhere else. Now you would put those on the board. Where do you put them? Well, you put them where the factories are. So let's just pop that factory piece on there. For example, that would have been there at the beginning of the game. And if that is one of the places the UK can build, which it is at the beginning of the turn, then you can now take those pieces that you bought during the beginning of the turn, slap them down on the UK, and now they're going to be available for use on the next turn. And then you collect your money. We won't get into all the nitty gritty, but essentially here, money is kept track of at the top of the board with all these little circles. What do the numbers represent? The numbers represent the value, the economic production value of all the territories that you control. We haven't talked about this yet, but you'll see each territory has a number in a circle there. And those are the IPC values of that territory. So you're going to start at a certain number that represents the number of territories that you control and the value of those territories. And as you gain or lose territory, your income level will adjust accordingly. So, for example, at the end of this combat here, when the UK conquered Holland, Belgium, that, as you see, is worth a value of 3. So we would have actually taken the UK's marker and adjusted that accordingly, as well as the German marker. So let's say, for example, that just for sake of illustration, the UK was at 13 before that combat. Well, we would immediately bump that up to 16, and we would have taken the German marker and moved it down 3 as well to indicate its current economic value. And that's how a turn of Axis and Allies works. Now that you've got the basics down, let's mention a couple of other important rules. Now, we're not going to go through every last nook and cranny of the rule book here in this video, but I do want to cover some of the important ones that are going to affect how you play the game every time you play it. And the first one of those important rules is this idea of combined arms. Now, the combat that I just ran you through used the attack and defense values of each unit as they're printed on the map. There are ways that those can be adjusted, and that's the idea of combined arms, which reflects the fact that when certain units battle together with each other, they actually improve the performance of the other unit. Now, here in the rulebook, we've got a handy chart that summarizes these effects. That is, when you are attacking, these are all on the attack, but if you attack with an infantry and an artillery together, that actually boosts the attack value of the infantry up to 2. So here, for example, we've got an infantry and an artillery. On their own, the infantry attacks at a 1, the artillery attacks at a 2. But paired together, they each attack at a 2. Follow that? So if they are fighting separately, they have 1 value. The infantry has 1 value anyway. And if the infantry is attacking together with an artillery, it actually attacks at a 2. Now, it still defends at a 2. That doesn't change its defense value, but it does attack at a 2. So what that means is it's a great idea strategically to build up both of these units and move them so that they are attacking together, because when they attack together, they boost the performance of the infantry. So similar, when you combined a mechanized infantry with an artillery, that mechanized infantry attacks as a 2 as well. And that makes sense because, like we said before, the mechanized infantry is infantry for all intents and purposes, but for the fact that it can move 2 instead of 1. Tactical bombers. Now, those guys are also very handy in terms of combined arms. They can do that in a couple ways. If a tactical bomber combines with a tank, or if it combines with a fighter, the tactical bomber itself increases its attack to 4. Now, in a normal circumstance, it would attack at a 3. Which is less than the fighter. Tactical bombers attack and defend at a 3. Right? And they cost 1 more IPC than the fighters. Fighters cost 10, attack bombers cost 11. So if you're just looking at those values, you're thinking, well, why would I pay more for something that has a weaker attack or weaker defense? Rather, they both attack at 3, but the attack bomber defends at a 3, whereas a fighter would defend at a 4. Well, the reason to pay more is because it opens up these options. And that is combined arms with either a tank or a fighter. If that attack bomber is attacking in the same battle as a tank or in the same battle as a fighter, now the attack bomber itself is attacking at a 4 as well. Which fighters, you'll recall, they only attack at a 3. So now this guy is tougher than the fighter. That alone makes it worth the investment. There's actually a couple other things attack bombers can do. Might get to later, but that's enough for now. Pairing a mech infantry with a tank allows a mech infantry to blitz. Okay, what do we mean by blitzing? And that just means moving through unoccupied territory. Classic example here in Alexandria. Let's put these guys up in northern Africa. So we've got a mechanized infantry, we've got a tank. Tanks have the unique ability to blitz. Now they have a 2 space movement value, which means this tank can actually go 1, 2. Let's say if it were wanting to attack Tunisia, and Libya was otherwise empty. Now, if this were friendly territory, both of these guys who can move to could move through Libya and then attack Tunisia. But you'll see here, Libya is Italian. So let's move them back, actually. Let's put them back in Alexandria and make it an easier example. Since Alexandria starts off as a UK territory, Tobruk is Italian, Libya is Italian. If there are, let's just make it German instead of Italian for illustration purposes. If there are enemy units in Tobruk, then neither of these units can go through one to get to the other. You can't, they're not magic. It's just total distance. So if they're moving into an adjacent territory that has an enemy unit, that's a combat move. You've got to conduct combat as it is. But let's say Tobruk, as it often is empty, and you really want to attack Libya with these land pieces that are in Alexandria. Well, they can do that because the tank has this ability to do what's called blitzing, which is blowing through this empty territory, conquering it by fact of having done that, and moving into Libya for the actual combat. So during its combat movement, it will go 1, 2 through Tobruk to get to Libya. It would actually drop a UK marker on Tobruk automatically for having done that. That's not something that the mechanized infantry can do on its own. It's just a little old infantry on wheels. So the best it could do is go boom and take that as a combat move. But if it is paired with a tank, now they can both take that blitz movement and get into Libya. Okay, so that's the combined arm ability of putting those two units together. What's this last one on the chart? Aircraft, so that's all types of aircraft: fighter, attack bomber, and strat bomber. If you pair them with a destroyer, that means they can hit subs. Okay, well, this one, if you think about it, kind of makes sense, right? Because here you've got a submarine, and it can just dive. So an aircraft flying over it using World War II technology is just not going to be able to hit that thing. But we mentioned earlier in the video, that the whole shtick of destroyers is that they have the ability to sound out those submarines and locate them. So any ship, in fact, can't attack a sub without a destroyer being present. It mentions those aircraft, but the ships, if in fact the sub decides to dive, and again, we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of all of that. There are still some details left to learn, but for purposes of this illustration, that sub has an opportunity at certain points in time to dive and avoid being hit, even by ships, but certainly by aircraft. Aircraft alone cannot attack a submarine. But if a destroyer, that's this guy, is present in the sea zone while they're attacking and participating in the attack, well, now it can combine arms with these aircraft, and if they're at all attacking the submarine, or to make it more logical, they're attacking a German submarine, now not only this destroyer, but anybody else participating in the combat, including these aircraft, can hit that submarine, because the destroyer keeps the submarine from disappearing because he can see the sub. So That's the combined arm effect with destroyers. A couple more things to learn. The first will be convoys. Now, you'll see right here in C-Zone 97, there's an imprinted symbol in there that says convoy. If you look around the rest of the board, you're going to see them in a number of locations, like C-Zone 93, C-Zone 105, 109, and all over the board. What are these? Well, all of these are coastal territories, coastal sea zones that are next to an important port on a adjacent land zone. And the idea is that these are places where military sea units of an opposing power can prevent the shipment of goods to that territory. And we represent that by these convoy zones, allowing these military ships to reduce the economic value of that adjacent land territory, representing the interdiction of these economic goods. So what that does is it's a way to economically attack your opponent in the game. So, for example, C-Zone 97 here borders a number of territories: southern Italy, northern Italy, Yugoslavia, Albania, and so forth. Let's say for these purposes that a battleship belonging to the UK ends its turn in C-Zone 97 here, which is a convoy zone. Well, that means that during the end of the Italian player's phase, if they haven't gotten rid of that battleship, the UK player is going to get to roll what we call a convoy roll, which is 1 die. For submarines and for aircraft carriers, it's 2. Aircraft, I suppose, that are on aircraft carriers. There would be 2 dice, but essentially there are some number of dice that are going to be rolled. And for every dot on that dice that is rolled, the Italian player is going to lose that many IPCs from their wallet, basically, from their collection of IPCs that they've collected during that turn. So that's a way of representing that you're economically attacking, trying to choke those out, put those territories under siege, and soften them up for an eventual invasion. Quick word about how pieces are represented on the board. You may be starting to think there are so many units that are going to be moving around on this board that they're hard to keep track of and even fit into these territories, even though the board game itself is 6 feet long. And that is accurate. A lot of these territories are just too small to fit everything that's in them, and frankly you're going to run out of little plastic pieces too. So what helps us keep track of these things immensely is these chips right here. So different people use them to represent different numbers, and that one's kind of arbitrary. The book will tell you one thing, people do their own thing. In this example here, we've got a guy standing on a white chip, a guy standing on a gray chip, and the white chip here represents 1 piece, the gray represents 2. So a guy standing on a white chip is meant to represent 2 infantry, and the guy standing on the gray chip would be 3 infantry. Again, that's just a way to stack these things in a way that saves plastic and saves room on the board. Quick word about some other pieces. So I mentioned earlier that tactical bombers have even other uses besides combined arms, and that has to do with bombing raids. So both tactical and strategic bombers have the ability to engage in what we call bombing raids, both tactical and strategic bombing raids. So the tactical bomber has the ability to raid facilities such as this naval base and this air base. Strategic bombers have the ability to drop bombs on our factories here, the things that actually make the goods. And we do that during the combat phase and the combat movement phase, but we roll those things separately. So you'll indicate that that's what they're doing, that they're conducting this bombing run as opposed to participating in a land battle, even if the two things happen in the same territory. And then before we engage in the land combat, we're going to run those bombing raids. So each one of the planes can target a particular facility. And before they roll their dice for damage, each of those facilities have a built-in anti-aircraft gun, so they'll get to roll that. And this operates the same way as a anti-aircraft gun piece would as well, which is when they are defending against air units, they have the ability to roll, and for each one, they get a hit. So let's say this strat bomber here is bombing this particular factory. A gun rolls a 3. So that means the bomber lives and it has its ability to do its damage. It's going to take that die, roll. Oh, look, it only gets a 1. So it does 1 point of damage to that factory. And the attack bomber, you can take this and do the same thing with other facilities as well. And so we'll represent that damage with chips, just like we would use them to stack up units as well. Now that factory has 1 bit of damage on it. And what that means is it can produce 1 less thing. So if that factory could produce 3 things, if it were a minor factory, now it can only produce 2 until that damage is resolved. And you can resolve the damage as the player that owns that factory by spending money to do that, 1 IPC per damage point. At the beginning of your turn when you are buying units. You can actually allocate that money to repairs instead of building at that point. We also mentioned air bases. What good are they? Well, they have 2 basic uses. The number 1 use is for extra movement. So let's say this German fighter is starting a turn in a space with an air base, and we're just pretending that the Germans own this territory for this example. That means that on its turn, this plane can actually move 5 spaces instead of the normal 4. If a strat bomber were located here, it could move 7 rather than 6 spaces. So that in itself, very useful. Air bases also allow something we call scrambling, and that's a defensive move. So let's again pretend that the Germans control this territory. They have this plane in that territory with an air base, and this German battleship here is located in Sea Zone 82. Well, if as a combat maneuver, the British bring this battleship into Sea Zone 82 in order to conduct combat with this battleship, well, then it gets to not only defend with the battleship, but the German player has the option of scrambling this fighter into the battle. That means a fighter located in an adjacent land unit, so it can't be anywhere else, not way over here, but it has to be in an adjacent land space, and that land space has to be one with an air base. So if the plane were here, for example, without an air base, it would not be able to scramble. Instead, it's here, it has this air base, and when the German player is defending, it has to declare whether or not this plane is going to participate in the battle as a scramble. So if it does that, it says, okay, I'm scrambling this plane. It gets act as a defender as well. And now we go to rolling the combat dice, and the German player is in a much better position than he would have been defensively had he not done that. He might not want to scramble his plane. He might want to save that plane for other uses that he has planned for it. But he has that option. Naval bases, they allow C units to move an extra space as well. So I mentioned all C units have a movement value of 2. This naval base, if they start in the territory with a naval base, they get 3 spaces that they can move. Naval bases do one other thing, which is repairing capital ships. What are capital ships? Capital ships are battleships and aircraft carriers. Each of these 2 units are special in that they can take 2 hits. So in combat, if they take a point of damage, that's reflected either by flipping them on their sides, or there are plenty of aftermarket goodies that you can put under them to indicate that they are damaged. But either way, these are damaged capital ships. that they have reduced capacity. The aircraft carrier, if it's damaged, for example, can't carry any air units, and no air units can land on it, and any air units that would be on there would be in trouble. But that the ship itself doesn't sink until it takes a second point of damage, and it'll stay damaged until it lands in a sea zone with a naval base. So if this damaged aircraft carrier were to end its turn in this sea zone, at the beginning of the next turn, it begins its turn in a sea zone adjacent to a naval base, it can flip back over, and now it's healed. So there are all sorts of other little details to talk about, but I don't want this intro rules video to be too long. So I want to mention just a few things about the board itself, and then about Global 1940 in particular, and we'll call it a day. We mentioned earlier that the board is divided into territories controlled by the various powers, and that control is indicated by both the color of the territory and the control marker printed on the map there. We also talked about their IPC values, but you'll notice there are other types of territories that are indicated by lighter colors and these hash symbols through them. And these are neutral territories, which kind of self-explanatory. They're not aligned with either the Axis or the Allies. So neutral powers are territories that you just can't pass through, you can't engage with, you can't even fly your planes over them unless you are going to engage in combat with them. Now, it is possible to attack a neutral country, but there's pretty severe consequences in doing so. And before we talk about that, there are three types of neutral territories on the board. There are true neutrals, indicated by countries like this here in Spain and Portugal. And then there are neutrals that are not aligned, but they lean towards one side or another. So Erie or Ireland here, for example, it says right on there, pro-allies, and the hash pattern on them, instead of going straight up and down, is actually bent to the left there, bent a little bit towards the U.S., so indicating that they are, in fact, sympathetic to the Allies. Now, there are a few that are pro-Axis as well. That includes Finland up here in the north. You see the lines go the other way, and it says pro-Axis right there under them. And Bulgaria down here in Eastern Europe, also pro-Axis, whereas Yugoslavia next door is pro-Allies. Pro-Allies here in Greece too. What does that mean? What does the pro mean? Well, that means if an Allied player, as a non-combat movement, by the way, moves one of their pieces into a pro-Allied territory, it's automatically going to side with the Allies. So UK drops one infantry here in Greece. This automatically becomes an Allied territory. The UK would drop one of their control markers on it, and their economic value would go up by 2, which is the value of this territory. You'll see the shadow, the silhouette of an infantry here with the number 4 next to it. That means that Greece has an army of 4 infantry. And in fact, again, one of those aftermarket things you can do is buy some neutral infantry and start the game with those pieces actually on the board. But they would now become 4 UK infantry. So you would now have a total of 5 there, and you would use chips to represent that. Now you've got 5 infantry there, all aligned with the UK, and they become UK pieces. Same thing if Germany were, for example, to move into Bulgaria, it would gain the 4 infantry indicated there, and that would become a German territory. But what if the UK wants to engage with this pro-Axis territory? Well, then those 4 infantry come alive, you might say, and that would have to be a combat move rather than a non-combat move. And now they fight. And the neutrals would roll that battle just as if they were on the opposite side. And of course, once that happens, those pieces stay on the board, and they remain until conquered. Now, if either party wants to attack a true neutral, well, that has real consequences. Not only do these folks come alive and they their territory. Their 8 infantry are now activated, and they stay there on the board. But the rest of the true neutrals on the board all take notice of that, and they all flip their allegiance. So if the Allies here, for example, were to attack Turkey, not only would they have to contend with the 8 infantry that Turkey wields, but now every single true neutral on the board becomes a pro-Axis territory. That means that now the Axis powers just need to walk into those territories and they become Axis. So here, for example, Afghanistan, pure neutral, but if you were to attack Turkey, now it becomes pro-Axis, and the Axis just need to walk into the territory and take it over. Don't need to fight it anymore. So once you break neutrality, that's a very serious thing with real ramifications across the entire globe. Not something you want to mess with, at least not accidentally. There are a few interesting spaces on the board. So the Sahara Desert here is impassable, it says. You can't fly a plane from Libya to French Central Africa, for example. You have to go around the desert and move in that way. There is a similarly unpassable region here in the Himalayas. There's one up here in the marshes. You can't go through these territories at all. And there are a couple choke points on the board that are worth noting. The first of these are canals. So the Panama Canal is right there, and the Suez Canal right there. Those are obviously artificial ways to get through the land. In order to travel your ships through them, you need to control the land territories around them. So for the Suez Canal, you need to control both Egypt and Transjordan at the beginning of your turn in order to move your ships through that Suez. And here you need to control Central America in order to roll through the Panama Canal. Now there are also a few straits on the board. Straits are narrow pieces of water that you need to control the land around them in order to move through. So right here between sea zones 91 and 92, you need to control the territory of Gibraltar in order to move your ship through there. Why that becomes important. Same thing up here. In order to move from sea zone 112 to 113, you need to control the territory of Denmark. And to move through the Bosphorus Straits down here, you need to control Turkey in order to move from sea zone 99 to 100. So as we mentioned, Turkey's a neutral. That's a tricky thing to pull off, but if you were inclined to move your ships up there and you really wanted to do that, that might be one reason why you would consider attacking Turkey. Otherwise, there are a few interesting bits on the board, but those are the important geographic features to understand. Last but not least, we're going to mention a couple of the high points of what makes global 1940 unique in terms of its political situation. The political situation is meant to reflect the historical timeline and when these countries got involved in the war and things going on in their own dynamics. So, for example, because you're starting this game in 1940, which historically speaking was before the U.S. got involved in the war, because it's before when Pearl Harbor happened, the U.S. starts off as a player that's not at war. So the declaration of war becomes an important thing. When you get certain countries involved in the war, it becomes a strategic choice. So the U.S. isn't in the war at the beginning. The UK Pacific, in other words, the Indian and Southeast Asian territories down here, this economy is not at war. Anzac is not at war at the beginning of the game. Japan and Russia, although they ultimately historically ended up at war with each other, they begin not at war with each other. Japan begins the game at war with no one until it decides to attack. Other than China, of course. China is another a country, and Japan's at war with China because it's already invaded by that point. You see all those coastal territories now belong to Japan. But it's only at war with China to begin with. It chooses when to declare war with Russia, with the United States, with UK and Anzac on this side of the board. So Russia itself also does not begin the game at war with anybody until it's attacked by the Axis powers, or until turn 4, I believe it is. At the beginning of turn 4, it can now enter the war on its own. It doesn't have to wait to be attacked anymore. Same with the U.S. The U.S. enters the war if it is attacked, or if another Axis power declares war on it. Or it can enter at the end of turn 3. It actually can declare war. Normally, declarations of war happen at the beginning of a turn. Or again, another trigger point if Japan attacks either the UK or Anzac on its turn, that can automatically draw the U.S. into the war as well. So again, when you attack certain countries, the timing of that becomes important with a lot of ramifications. There are also several specific bonuses that reflect the country's real historical interests during the war. If you occupy certain land zones, for example, certain territories, you get extra economic bonuses. That happens when, for example, Japan owns all of China, or if the U.S. conquers certain islands in the Pacific, they get bonuses. These 4 Southeast Asian islands down here, if you own all 4 of those, that earns you an extra bonus of IPCs, just because of the economic value of those islands. I won't get into all of them. Some of the ones that we play with are house rules, some are out of the box, but they're all meant to reflect those national objectives that each country has. Even though they're part of an alliance, each country has its own independent interests and historical situation as well. So always more to talk about, lots of details to get into, and interesting situations, but that, I think, is enough of an introduction to Axis and Allies Global 1940 to get you started. Happy hunting.